Good evening, friend. If you're listening now, you're likely wrapped in the quiet of your own space. Lights low, perhaps under a blanket, eyes growing heavy. Tonight, let's drift gently, back not into the tales of kings or battles, but into the slow and sleepy rhythm of life in a small medieval village, a place without urgency, without noise, just a soft hum of daily repetition, rooted in the earth and the seasons. The fire had dimmed overnight, so the first task was to stir it back to life. Whoever was first to rise often the mother or eldest daughter would gently blow on the embers, perhaps adding straw or thin twigs, coaxing warmth back into the hearth. Fire meant heat, light, and the ability to cook. Without it, nothing else began. Let your mind settle, and we'll begin. Ale was safer to drink than water in many cases. The Lord's reeve or bailiff might inspect the fields. The men would gather tools, wooden plows, scythes, or mattock sand. Head to the open fields. Women, too, labored outside when needed, especially at planting or harvest time. But they were also keepers of the home's rhythm, not the strong kind brewed for feasts, but a very weak small beer made for children and workers alike. It was nourishing, slightly tangy, and gave the body energy for what lay ahead. Pigs, often semi-wild, might root through scraps near the edge of the village. It was not unpleasant, at least not to those who lived it. It was simply the smell of life, of real, gritty, grounded life. Cows, or goats, were penned more securely, as they were too valuable to lose. Pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, sometimes flavored with scraps of salted meat, if it was available, sitting on a stool near the doorway, soaking up the rare sun, watching the chickens, listening to the distant call of someone leading oxen to the far field. A toothache that worsened, a fire that smoked instead of catching, a goose that wandered off, and always, the looming pressure of weather. Voices rose in brief exchange, then returned to silence. What did villagers speak of around the fire? What hopes stirred quietly in the hearts of people whose names were never written down? No rush, no deadlines, only the slow movement of sun and shadow across thatched rooftops and rough stone walls. Too much rain ruined crops, too little meant thirst. The pot was rarely emptied, only added to. It bubbled on the hearth endlessly, changing slightly with each day. Religion wasn't just belief, it was a schedule, a framework. It told people when to plant, when to fast, and when to rest. Even if you couldn't read, you knew when Michaelmas was coming. If they were taught to read or write at all, it was usually by a priest, and only if they were male and deemed promising. Spinning wool, repairing fences, gathering firewood. Life in a medieval village was work unending, repetitive, but understood. Each person had a role, and though the tasks were dull by modern standards, they carried the village through the cycles of the year, long before alarm clocks or glowing screens. Morning in a medieval village began with the natural rhythm of the sun and the animals, but by memory, by paths, or sometimes just a furrow in the soil. Buckets were wooden and heavy when filled, and water wasn't just for drinking, it was needed for cooking, washing, and sometimes even livestock. If it were spring, there'd be the fresh green scent of new shoots. If it was winter, the land lay asleep, just like much of the village still was. You learned how to bake bread by watching your mother or grandmother fold the dough, then slide it carefully into the communal oven, using a long-handled peel. The rooster's crow wasn't just it was a consistent signal, not just to the family but to the entire community, that the day had quietly begun. Families had their own dough, often marked with an impression, perhaps a thumbprint, or unique twist, so they didn't know which loaves were theirs when they retrieved them. The cottage was modest, a single room, shared by all. The air inside the cottage was cool, often damp. Windows, if the home had any, were small and covered in oiled cloth or horn, not glass. They let in a little light, but not much, and so the firelight would cast its soft orange glow, flickering across stone and timber, Outside, mist curled low across the fields. These were strips of land assigned to narrow plots that sometimes stretched over a mile, divided not by fences. Clothing wasn't changed daily. Most villagers owned only a single tunic. In the early hours, they didn't get dressed so much as pull themselves upright, tighten their belts, and step into another day. Wool, coarse linen, bare feet, or simple leather shoes. If they were lucky, everything had been patched many times. A new garment was an event. Breakfast, if it could be called. That was often a crust of bread from the day before, maybe softened in ale or warm water. The village belore in its absence. A handbell rung by the reeve-wood signaled the time to begin. Everyone had their place. Fetching water was no simple task. The well might be a 10-minute walk or more. Children had chores early, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, watching younger siblings. There was no school in most villages, but much of learning was by doing, by repetition, by following. You learned how to thatch a roof, by helping someone do it. Yes, most villages had a shared oven. Firewood was precious. It made more sense to bake all the village's bread in one place. Livestock was part of daily life. Chickens wandered freely, scratching at the earth, and the smells were honest. Earth, sweat, smoke, manure, souring milk, baking bread. As morning gave way to midday, villagers looked forward to their primary meal. Dinner, what we now think of as lunch, was the heartiest. And then there were duties not tied to the seasons. Mending nets. There were moments of pause. Of course, mid-morning or midday might offer time for quiet. And through it all, the church bell tolled the hours, the prayers, and the calendar of saints. Yet despite the routine, each day brought its own small uncertainties. And so, by midday, the hum of the village was steady. Fires crackled. Metal clinked, hooves thudded softly. But what was life truly like inside those cottages? As evening returned, as the sun drifted lower, and the long shadows stretched across the fields, the village began to slow. The animals were gathered back, sometimes willingly, often not. Chickens were herded toward their roosts. Pigs were shooed away from gardens, and goats were tugged back toward pens with gentle coaxing and stubborn resistance. Remember, candles were rare luxuries, and oil was precious. The same space that held sleeping mats and work tools also served as the kitchen, bedroom, nursery, and occasionally stable. Yes, it was common to shelter smaller livestock, indoors goats, chickens, or a prized pig might sleep in the same room. Their warmth was useful in colder months, and thieves or wolves were real threats. Most homes lived in darkness once the sun disappeared, save for the flicker of the hearth. The light shifted to a golden hue, what we might now call magic hour. But for them, it was simply a sign. Time to end a day's labor before the world grew too dim to see clearly. If a candle sputtered during prayer, it meant a spirit was near. Children were warned never to whistle after dark, lest they summon a night wind or wandering soul. Many of these beliefs blended Christianity with older, local customs passed through centuries. Inside the cottages, the family gathered. No separate rooms, no privacy as we understand it today. If a thatch roof collapsed, neighbors helped repair it. If someone fell ill, others brought food. The manors, lord or reeve, might seem distant, but among villagers, there was little room for isolation. Even children learned to tease raw fleece, twist it into thread, and eventually wind it onto spindles. Looms were simple but effective. Beds with straw mattresses, loose, scratchy, and sometimes shared by several people. A woven blanket or a rough wool cover was drawn up. In colder months, bodies curled together for warmth. Babies might sleep tucked into arms, while older children lie close together near the heart. A single tunic could take weeks to finish, but the repetition was part of life. Stars overhead, visible through gaps in the thatch, seemed closer in those days. No city light to dim them, just the canopy of night, vast and ancient. Spindles spun beside the fire, often during storytelling or quiet moments. A baby that stopped feeding Many prayed for saints to intercede, for Mary to offer mercy, and for the wind to carry away the sickness before it reached their door. There was no escaping the village, no dream of travel or city, life not for most. To be a medieval villager was to be a part of something larger than oneself. A thread in a woven fabric, plain but essential. One family's disaster was everyone's disruption. Every morning the fire was rekindled, bread was broken, fields were walked, babies were born, marriages arranged, and graves dug in the soft earth by the churchyard. A single spark could leap from a neglected hearth, catching dry straw, rushing through homes too close together. That's why most fires were banked carefully before a bed piled with ash to reduce the flame to a slow, smoldering glow, enough to relight in the morning, but not enough to rise. Iron nails were valuable. They were pried from ruined boards and hammered straight again. Every object had a second life. The Lord's Prayer was known by all recited slowly, with hands folded or resting on knees. If someone wanted to know how old they were, it was the priest who might remember the year of their birth linked to a saint's day, or a storm, or a village event. The church wasn't just a building on the hill, it was the anchor of the week. What traces remain of those nameless villagers, their routines, their tools, their whispered prayers, holy days, feast days, and fast days all shaped the calendar. Even the cycle of the moon was watched for signs. Waste wasn't a concept because nothing could be wasted. Even ashes from the hearth were used for soap making. When mixed with fat, if bread remained from earlier, it would be served alongside, sometimes cheese, sometimes pickled vegetables, and occasionally a bit of dried fruit. The diet was repetitive, but surprisingly sustained. Dinner was lighter than the midday meal often, but the quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of shared labor, of known patterns. When someone did speak, it was often to share village gossip, who had fallen ill, whose cow had calved, or which traveler had passed through on the road to the abbey. Conversation, when it happened, was sparse and simple. Most villagers were too tired to chatter. Stories were shared, too. Folk tales, saints' lives, local legends. Grandparents might repeat the same tales night after night of forest spirits, of cursed wells, of saints who had healed with a glance. These stories weren't told just for entertainment, but for grounding. They made sense of a world why crops failed, why a child grew sick, why winter stayed too long, and overlaying all of it was superstition, deep and quiet, like a stream under ice. Salt was never spilled without making the sign of the cross. I hear crossing your path in the morning. Bad luck, better to delay your work. The village itself was like a living body. Everyone depended on everyone else. And still, beneath the simplicity, there was craft. Wool was spun with practiced fingers. Wooden tools were carved, mended, and reused. As the evening deepened, prayers were said. Clergy, often the only literate men in a village, served as both spiritual guides and keepers of knowledge. After prayer, families settled into sleep. Outside, the village stilled. The occasional bark of a dog, an owl's cry, the rustle of leaves. But while the village slept, fears lingered in the shadows. Fear of fire, fear of thieves, fear of death. Fire was especially dangerous. Then there was illness. No understanding of germs. Only signs. A cough that wouldn't stop. A rash that spread. Still, life continued. It was a rhythm so complete, so absorbing, that few ever questioned it. Yet one wonders, how did the quiet dignity of these lives shape the world we know today? The medieval village was not a place of grand ambition or reinvention. It was a place of endurance. And while the rhythm of daily life brought stability, it was the quiet ways villagers faced death, preserved memory. Life expectancy was short, but not because people simply dropped dead young. It was childhood that was most perilous. Candles were lit if they could be spared. Children saw it, spoke of it. Death was not the end of conversation, it was part of it. The funeral procession moved slowly, the body carried on a wooden board or a makeshift stretcher, often covered with the household's best woolen cloth. Names were remembered in prayers, in stories, sometimes scratched onto wood. If a family had means, perhaps a small stone, no coffin, just earth, a boy learned how his father drove the oxen, patched the roof, and mended the harness. Skills were memory. Memory was survival. Autumn was gathering and preserving cabbages buried in pits, apples dried, meat salted, and herbs hung in smoky corners. May Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas, and Christmas each, with its own traditions, dancing, sometimes shared meals, church processions, and yes, even laughter. For all its hardship, village life held joy. It wasn't exuberant, but it was real. Winter was endurance. Fires carefully fed. Tasks moved indoors. Tools repaired. Stories told. A feast might follow, with simple gifts. Bread, cheese, and a chicken. Music was local, a fiddle, a drum, or maybe just singing. And yet, it could be moving. A shared celebration of survival. Survive that, and you might see 50 or 60 years withered, bent, but alive. They pieced together the boring details. What people ate, how they built their homes, and where the midden heat lay. Too many, it might seem dull, but to us, it is a kind of miracle. To know how ordinary people lived, not just how kings ruled. Small disputes were handled by the reeve or manorial court. Warm and distant from that era, we might still feel a kinship, a quiet echo of a woman who stoked a morning fire 600 years ago, of a boy who fed chickens at dawn, of a family who sat near the glow of a hearth, telling tales of spirits in the woods. That trust was built in small, repeated actions, helping to mend a roof, sharing extra eggs, and offering a hand at harvest, a bench under the same tree, year after year. Would they pity us or envy us? Or would they simply shake their heads and return to their fire? No maps, just knowledge passed by footsteps. Repetition, on knowing the season by the smell of the wind, on waking with the sun and ending the day beside the hearth, on stories whispered in smoky corners and footprints worn into packed earth. Bonds weren't declared, they were lived. A girl married off to a man in a distant village, a wanderer who didn't return. Their names stayed for a while, then some just faded, remembered only in place names, or under farmers' fields. Yet someone, somewhere, might still remember the way they laughed, the way they milked a goat, or how they once danced barefoot in a muddy lane. A pig was found in someone else's garden, a fence moved, a loaf was stolen. Punishments were rarely brutal more, often fines, labor, or restitution. Community mattered too much to isolate anyone for long, and passed on their world. They gave the village its deeper strength. Death was no stranger here. It visited early and often, sometimes slipping in quietly with a fever, other times roaring through in waves, famine, pestilence, a bad winter. Still, the village knew death intimately, and it was not hidden. The body was washed by family or neighbors, laid out near the hearth, prayers said. The church bell tolled for the dead, often just once for each year of life. The pottage simmered. The plow cut new furrows. The lost were missed, but not dwelt upon endlessly. There was no time for that. Survival demanded attention. Burials were simple. A shallow grave dug by hand in the churchyard, lined with nothing more than the hopes of heaven. And then life resumed. Children carried forward their parents' tools. A girl inherited her mother's spindle, her shape of kneading dough. The seasons were their true calendar. Spring brought lambing and sowing. Summer, long days in the fields. Festivals offered relief from the cycle. Weddings were small but meaningful. Hand fastings binding hands. With cloth work common. Justice, too, was local. There was a slow-moving wisdom in all of it. The sense that nothing came quickly. Even the physical village was shaped by memory. Paths curved where carts had worn ruts. Walls built from stone, plucked over generations. And then there were those who disappeared not by death, but by choice or necessity. A boy sent to a The medieval village was not static. It grew, changed, and adapted. Plagues wiped some out entirely. Others became towns, but the essence remained. A way of life built not on grandeur, but on repetition. Archaeologists today study these villages through broken pottery, post holes, and soil layers. And so, as we settle into our modern bed, their names are gone, but their lives were real. And in some small way, their routines built the world we now live in. But what would those villagers think of us? Our noise, our speed, our light-filled nights? Settle in, listener. Breathe slowly. Let the noise of the day drift away like fog over a country lane. Tonight, we follow not a general or a king, but a man with a leather satchel, a worn coat, and a donkey named Mabel. Nor was he particularly swift, but he was reliable, and that mattered more. This is the tale of a village postman in the early 1800s, forgotten by most but vital to many. There are no train tracks where we begin, no chugging steam engine or iron bridges, just a narrow path winding through hills, sometimes lost under puddles or veiled in snow. This was Devonshire, rural England, around the year 1824. No envelope. The addresses were written in long, looping script. Mrs. Ellen Crouch, Lower Barton Farm, or Mr. Basil Heath, by the third gate beyond the mill. A parcel from London meant someone had a son working in the city. Knocked, waited. An elderly woman opened the door with a thin smile. A creased letter with trembling ink meant bad news, often delivered with a pause and a lowered voice. Directions were often landmarks, not numbers. If you didn't know the area, you'd never find them. His cottage stood at the edge of the village, a crooked structure with ivy climbing up its side and a gate that never latched properly. Mabel was kept in a shed out back, and she often greeted him with a slow blink and a sniff, as if weighing whether today was worth the bother. They stopped near a stone wall, where Edwin took out a hunk of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a flask of weak tea. Mabel nibbled on grass and eyed the crust in his hand. He tossed her the last bite. Bless her heart, she's not forgotten me. Mabel carried most of the weight. She was small, shaggy, and stubborn, but steady. From there, the track curved back toward the village. Mabel always picked up her pace here, knowing food and rest were not far off. But he stitched together the lives of others, one parcel, one muddy mile at a time, all because Edwin and Mabel walked their quiet path. But Edwin had little worth stealing, and Mabel bit hard if threatened. He rubbed Mabel's neck, removed her harness, and led her into her shed. Then he stepped into his own cottage, stamped the mud from his boots, and set the mailbag on the table. Tomorrow, it would be filled again. Shadows lengthened as he neared the final farms, and the sky turned slate gray. A stop at one cottage brought tears on envelope with black edging. A cousin lost at sea. Edwin stayed a while, not saying much, just letting the presence be a kind of comfort. Boots became soaked, letters wrinkled. He dried them by the hearth at night if needed, careful not to smudge the ink. They were known to every farmstead and village from Stoke Hill to Bickler Vale. Others turned into chats by the crops, village gossip. He never rushed. The post was important, yes, but so was the presence. Edwin was one of the few who traveled between isolated homesteads. Too many. He was a bridge to the outside world. If someone wasn't home, he left a twig tucked in the hinge of the door. It meant, I came by, I'll return. Everyone understood it. The smell of wet earth, of hay, of smoke curling from distant chimneys, filled the air. It was a quiet world. Birds called. Boots squelched. Occasionally, someone waved from a field with a muddy hand. The sun hadn't yet touched the frost when Mr. Edwin Harrow buttoned his coat, checked the cinch on Mabel's harness, and hoisted his leather mailbag over his shoulder. He wasn't young. 6 days a week, Edwin walked a road across 11 miles of rough terrain, delivering letters, parcels, and occasionally a newspaper, if someone could afford one. The British postal system had improved significantly by the 1800s, but it was still a work in progress, especially in the countryside. The penny post wouldn't become universal until 80. So, in Edwin's day, Postage was often paid by the recipient. That meant each delivery came with questions. Did the household still want the letter? Could they afford to accept it? Edwin kept a small ledger. He started his route just after first light. They moved at a walking pace. The path took them past stoned fences, sheep fields, and lanes hemmed by Most of the letters were folded sheets of paper sealed with wax. But Edwin did. He delivered more than just mail. He carried news. A birth announced by letter might already be whispered ahead by Edwin's tongue. At the first stop, a cottage with a thatched roof and a broken fence. A parcel from your daughter in Plymouth, Edwin said, pulling a wrapped bundle from his bag. The woman held it like something sacred. He tipped his hat, made a small note in his ledger, and continued on. Some stops were brief. By midday, Mabel's pack was lighter. Sometimes it rained, sometimes it snowed. He wrapped his coat tighter and pressed on. The mail didn't stop for weather. There were dangers, too. Stray dogs, swollen streams, the rare footpad lurking on a remote path. He carried a small lantern in winter months. Its glow like a firefly in the dusk. The route ended near a hill where an old oak stood twisted like a clenched fist. By the time Edwin reached home, stars were peeking through clouds. His was a life of slow devotion. He didn't change the world. He didn't build monuments. But one wonders how many lives turned because of a letter he delivered. How many loves, rekindled dreams, altered decisions, swayed. Morning returned, as it always did, soft and gray, dew beating on the hedges, the sound of distant crows echoing across the moor. Edwin Harrow stirred before dawn. His joints creaked like old wood. More letters. More boots to soak and roads to tread. He sat on the edge of his small straw-stuffed mattress, ran his hands through thinning gray hair, and let out a breath that sounded older than he was. This was how it came in from the larger post depot to towns away. Riders would pass through just before midnight, leaving the bundle for Edwin to sort come morning. He untied the twine, adjusted his spectacles, and began reading the addresses aloud to himself in a whisper. The letter to Miss C.R. went in last, snug between two parcels of seeds and a folded copy of the Western Gazette. The handwriting was elegant, to fine for this region. Addressed only to Miss C.R., Hillgate Cottage, no full name, and receiving small smiles or a clumsy thank you from children eager to watch the donkey. "Is there a letter for my D.A.?" he asked. "From Portsmouth." Same handwriting as last week. His father was a dock worker, temporarily stationed far away. The trees pressed close, and the lane narrowed until it was little more than a path hemmed by mossy stones and foxglove. Whitewashed long ago, the paint had faded into a patchwork of lichen and soot. Smoke curled from a squat chimney. Vines hung over the windows like curtains of green lace. Mabel hesitated near a low branch, sniffed, and carried on. His letters, written in rough but affectionate lines, brought joy to the household. Mabel plodded without complaint, her hooves sucking quietly in and out of the soaked earth, thin, cloaked, her face partially turned. No town, just a place in the candlelight. He inspected the stack of mail left in the clay pot near his door. Mrs. Dalloway, Old Mill Road. Mr. Pike, the cooper near Redmond's Cross. Captain Halley, retired. Some names were regulars. Others were rare, perhaps. Someone new had moved to the area, or a long-forgotten relative had found a scrap of parchment and sentiment. One letter, though, made him pause. Inside was a tiny stitched blanket and a note. She would have wanted another baby to have this. No cinder, enough for oats kindling and occasional new boots. But Edwin was not poor in the ways that matter. He was greeted with warmth, given bread in winter. Inside, in neat script, it read, "Thank you for bringing my world to me." Soup when he looked pale. A new scarf, one Christmas, knitted in mismatched yarn by 3 village sisters. Just kindness, folded in wool. He rarely left the region, but his name was known, gently spoken in kitchens and parlors, and when his boots fell silent on the lane, people noticed. Edwin turned it over, examined the seal plain wax. unremarkable, and set it aside carefully. He knew where Hillgate Cottage was, and in worn leather bags when the letters are burned, the paper fades, and the paths grow over with moss. Edwin was never part of the stories, only the messenger, but he carried them with care, as if each piece of mail contained a secret heartbeat. Leonard lived alone on the edge of a quarry, silent, grim. Few spoke with him. The letter, from a daughter he hadn't seen in 2 decades, simply read, "I forgive you. Come home if you wish." The next morning, Leonard packed his bag and left. No goodbye, just gone, high on a slope, nearly overgrown by thyme and ivy. "Thank you," she said, almost inaudibly, and closed the door. A widow lived there, or perhaps a spinster. Folks disagreed. She rarely came to the village. Some said she spoke with ghosts. Others simply said she preferred silence. After feeding Mabel and brushing her mane with a handful of straw, Edwin packed his bag. As he walked away, he wondered, what was in that letter? A confession, an apology, a final goodbye. The path that morning was soft with mud. It had rained during the night, and the sky was heavy again. Edwin made his usual stops, passing over letters, sharing the weather forecast, ended affairs, brought warnings of illness or news of inheritances. Edwin understood this. Each delivery was a private history unfolding. At one farm, a young boy waited eagerly by the gate. Edwin flipped through his stack. The boy beamed and ran back inside, the letter held above his head like a trophy. Later, as Edwin approached Hillgate Cottage, the air grew still. Hillgate Cottage was old. Edwin knocked gently on the weathered oak door. Silence. He knocked again. A long pause, then the soft creak of a latch. The door opened a hand's width. A woman stood in the shadows. "You've a letter," Edwin said gently, holding it out. She reached through the gap, her fingers pale and elegant. "From whom?" "No return address. Just for you." She paused. Edwin stood for a moment, unsure if he should linger, then tipped his hat and turned back to Mabel. He would never know, but it would haunt his thoughts for days. Letters weren't just words on paper. They were catalysts. They mended family rifts or deepened them. They proposed marriage. Once, he delivered a letter to a man named Leonard Tabb. Edwin thought of that often. Another time, a package went to a family who'd lost a child the previous winter. These moments, quiet, barely noticed, were the threads of rural life. The job itself paid little. He'd never married. He once delivered a letter to himself, slipping it anonymously into his stack. He never found out who sent it. But what happens to those stories? The ones carried quietly on the backs of donkeys. Years passed, as they always do, slowly but with certainty. Seasons turned, boots wore thin, and the fields that Edwin Harrow once crossed so easily began to feel longer. His pace had slowed, imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably. Mabel, too, was no longer young. Her back dipped more deeply, and her gait had become a careful shuffle rather than a confident plod. But still, each morning rain, frost, or bloomy rose laced his boots and reached for the bag. It was a phrase that made his brow furrow. He sat at his small table, holding the letter, its language foreign in tone and purpose. By 1831, the world beyond his village was changing quickly. The postal reform movement was gaining ground. Conversations about stamps, uniform rates, and centralized sorting filled London rooms. Donkeys are no longer standard equipment. But out here, in Devon's quiet lanes, Edwin's method hadn't changed in decades. People had begun to say, he's the last of his kind. One cold February morning, Edwin received a notice in the depot sack. A new postmaster would be visiting from Exeter to review rural delivery efficiency. When the postmaster arrived, wearing a fine wool coat, shiny boots, and a brisk London air, Edwin offered him tea. The man declined, barely glancing at the worn walls of Edwin's cottage. No one made a fuss at Edwin's request, but when he set out that morning, he found surprises waiting. "You've served faithfully," the postmaster said. "But centralization is coming. Routes will be restructured. For your evenings, they said, when you're no longer wet and freezing. It read, you carried more than letters. You carried hope. No name, just those words. Edwin nodded slowly. Mabel won't be pleased. He paused, resting his hand on Mabel's neck, and listened. No sounds of progress, just the wind. A bird, a far-off, bleating of sheep. The woman's face crumpled as she read the first lines. He's coming home, she said, her voice breaking. Next month, she's the queen of the road, the girl explained. The man did not smile. You'll receive a modest pension, of course, back pay for the years. You may retire with dignity. He'd been delivering to her. For years her sons had moved away, one to Canada, the other to Leeds. The letter was from the latter. He took to whittling small animal figurines, lining them along his windowsill. He wrote letters now, mostly thank yous and musings to people he once delivered to. They raised a toast. There was no plaque, but his name remained, not loud. Roots and notes like mind the dog at Fernhill, and leave behind the broken gate if no answer. Not wild, just warm. Retire. The word felt odd in his mouth. Edwin had never imagined stopping. Then, I suppose I'm ending on a high note. Naturally, the path, the letters, the quiet nods at gates these. Things weren't work. They were simply life. But the decision was made. Mabel, now fully retired, grazed in a nearby pasture, fat and content. His final route was set for the following Saturday. Word spread quietly through the region, but once for every decade, he had walked the land. At the first cottage, a girl presented him with a hand-drawn picture of Mabel wearing a crown. At the next farm, someone had baked seed cake, still warm. Another stop offered a tin of tea leaves wrapped in cloth. Even Hillgate Cottage, usually silent, had left something behind, a single folded note tucked into the gate. The sun was high when Edwin reached his favorite overlook, rise in the land where one could see the patchwork fields stretched to the horizon. I suppose that's it, he said to Mabel, who blinked slowly, unimpressed. He reached into the bag for his final delivery. One letter remained, addressed to a woman in a farmhouse near the stream. He knocked and handed it over. Edwin tipped his hat. He turned toward home. That evening, the village Pabrelli Full was nearly overflowing. People had gathered quietly, bringing what they could. Bread, stew, cider, and stories. To Edwin, they said. And to Mabel, he smiled gently, a little embarrassed, but grateful. And for once, he let someone else speak while he simply listened. Retirement was strange at first. The early mornings stretched long. He kept walking, too. Not every day, and not with a satchel, but his boots found familiar lanes. Years later, when Edwin passed quietly in his sleep, the church bell rang 7 times. Not for his age, which was near 70. The village raised no statue. Children still whispered, "That's the lane." Edwin walked. Old-timers pointed to hedgerows and said he once delivered through a snowstorm that buried the barns. And in a dusty ledger tucked in the village post office, still hand-copied once every few years, was the careful record. He'd kept Nate's one page. Was marked differently, in someone else's handwriting. It simply read, he delivered more than mail. He delivered the world. But how many other Edwins were there? Quiet postmen and postwomen across valleys, deserts, and snowy passes, who never made history books but stitched the fabric of everyday life. Welcome back, dear listener. As you nestle into your space blanket drawn, lights dimlit drift far beyond the foggy hills of Devon and into the sun-baked roads of the Roman Empire. Not to a battle, but what was life like for the men who earned it? In one of its many dusty border provinces, Pannonia, where modern-day Hungary meets Australucius, sets out before dawn, not to a Senate speech or a gladiator's roar. His belt hangs with a gladiator short, practical Sordanda dagger. Over one shoulder, he slings a wooden frame pack with everything he owns. Spare tunic, tools, wax, tablets, eating bowl. The marching kitchen soldiers carried was basic but essential. The air is sharp, with a smell of old leather, metal polish, and smoke from the campfires. Now little more than ash. Lucius wraps his woolen cloak tight, his breath visible in the morning chill. Around him, fellow soldiers stir, groaning quietly as they stretch limbs sore from yesterday's drills. The road, though ancient by our standards, was straight and purposeful paved, with flat stones, built by earlier units using picks and shovels. Tonight, we follow a quieter tale, that of a foot soldier named Lucius, marching not for glory, but for his daily ration of bread, wine, and salt. Drinking wasn't casual, it followed a rhythm. First officers, the older soldiers, then recruits. His father, a farmer, had once shown him the trick. Strange how that memory lingered stronger than most from his years at war. Lucius barely looked. He'd seen so many. They were like trees in a forest, always there, one so prized that it formed part of Roman soldiers' wages. From it, we get the word salary. The year is 108 AD. The Roman Empire stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the edges of Arabia. The barracks are still dark, save for oil lamps swinging softly in the breeze. It was traded, stored in blocks, and sometimes even issued directly as payment. One recruit vomited on the side of the road. Too much sun, too little pacing. The pain became background noise. A medicus, traveling with the rear column, gave him watered vinegar and ordered him to carry on its banks. The ruins of an old camp, left from a campaign 3 years ago, are found. The centurion raised his hand, and the column halted. Lucius had once received 3 bundles of salt instead of coin. He used one to trade for a blanket, another way to clean wounds. The last he guarded like treasure. Canvas pulled tight, pegs hammered into dry earth, cooking pit dug. The latrine is marked at a safe distance, all done with practiced speed. Even tired, the soldiers moved like cogs in a well-oiled device. The armor now pressed hot against his skin. Sweat darkened the linen beneath, but discipline forbade complaining. A Roman soldier endured. That was the pride. Bread was always there, dense, flat, more survival than pleasure. He straps on his gear armor first, not the gleaming breastplates of marble statues, but segmented iron strips, tied with leather cords, dented from years of service. A Roman legion always slept lightly, half in armor, weapons within reach. Lucius lay on the hard ground, cloak pulled tight, shield propped beside him. No shade. Earth below, somewhere in the dark, an owl called. It reminded him that somewhere beyond the horizon, someone knew his name. How strange that the thing that flavored his food, cleaned his wounds, and preserved his pay had come to mean value itself. Dinner was lentils and millet, stirred into a thick porridge, or simply of a warm hearth. A good meal, and shoes without blisters, Saul added. Of course. One man joked it tasted like sand. Another said sand had more flavor. They all laughed, not because it was funny, but because the laughter dulled the aches. Conversation was low comments about feet, dreams of wine, complaints about officers spoken just quietly enough. In the fading light, they cleaned their feet, aired wounds, and checked gear. Maintenance was survival. No benches, just ground. Then there's his helmet, heavy, tight-fitting, and lined with felt. Its cheek guards clink faintly as he lifts it onto his head. On it, he'd begun a message to his brother back in Campania. It read only, "Still marching. Roads never end. Send olives if you can." By now, it fits like a second skull. With pack secured and shield slung over his back, Lucius joins the formation gathering in the yard. The centurion, grizzled, scarred, respected, paces slowly in front of the cohort. His voice cracks in the morning like thunder. 20 Roman miles today. Keep your step. No stragglers. Lucius groans inwardly. That's over 80 modern miles on foot, under armor, carrying nearly 80 pounds of gear. The march begins. The Roman military machine was efficient, disciplined, and orderly. Soldiers walked in step, shields rattling in unison. They passed milestones, literal one-stone markers every 1,000 paces. carved with the name of the emperor who commissioned them. At intervals, they stopped for water, canteens filled at streams, or small wells dug by previous legions. Lucius liked to chew cumin seeds while walking, not for flavor, but to stave off thirst and nausea. By midday, the sun had climbed, casting long shadows from the columns of men. At lunch, they stopped in a clearing. Each man pulled out his ration, hardtack biscuits, a handful of dried figs, and, if fortunate, a strip of salted pork. Salt was the key, not just for flavor, but for preserving meat, preventing cramps, and restoring balance to sweating beta. After eating, the men lay back briefly, helmets tilted to shield their eyes from the sun. Then the horn sounded again, time to move. The afternoon march was worse. Feet swelled in boots made from stitched cowhide. Dust rose in clouds. Lucius remembered his first march like that. He'd nearly collapsed, thought he wouldn't survive. But his legs grew stronger. He looked now at the younger soldiers around him, many just boys from Iberia, Orgal faces still round, hands still soft. They'd harden soon enough. By late afternoon, a river came into view, wide and slow. Pitch tents, he barked. 2 hours before dark, the work began. Each contubernium, a group of 8 soldiers, was responsible for setting its tent. Lucius and his group lit a fire in boiled water. They sat on stones, backs against packs. Someone passed around a flask of cheap wine, watered down, sour, but welcome. Lucius opened his satchel and pulled out a folded wax tablet. He didn't expect a reply, but writing steadied him. Night fell. Guards were posted. The camp quieted. Stars above. He stared upward and thought not of Rome, not of war but of salt. But what did Lucius dream of as he lay beneath foreign stars? Was it of victory? Morning arrived, not with trumpets or glorious fanfare, but with the soft rattle of armor being lifted, and the muted groans of tired men. A century of soldiers stirred in near silence. Sleep had come in short fragments. Another day, another march, another routine to ordinary forsong. Today it was wheat flour, a wedge of sheep's cheese and crucialia, pinch of salt, not just seasoning, but status. That grainy white mineral was still one of the empire's most vital commodities, stored in pouches, packed into clay jars, even weighed into payments. Cold ground, creaking joints, the occasional cry from a fellow dreaming of home or of something he couldn't forget. It was not a hostile place, but it was wary. Many in the provinces did not trust Rome's promises, even after decades of occupation. And the soldiers understood this. They were guests with spears. Sheep scattered as the cohort entered. Chickens darted under carts. Children peeked from behind low stone walls, wide-eyed and silent. He read the requisition grain oil. Wynand handed it over. The elders nodded. Sent runners. There was no argument. Not here. The soldiers ate slowly, trying not to intimidate. They weren't at war here, but peace required as much effort. Rome asked politely. Only once, Lucius rubbed the sleep from his eyes, blinking up at the pale sky streaked with gray. Before they moved out, the men were given their He sat on a low stone, stretching his legs. A small legionary helmet and all, made from olive wood. The boy caught Lucius' gaze and smiled. Maba would have liked the shade here, he thought idly, and then realized Maba was a donkey from a different story. He chuckled to himself. The heat was getting to him. Less than glamorous, but essential. Roman camps had standardized sanitation systems, more advanced than most towns for centuries to come. Trenches were dug at precise angles, always downhill from the tents, with shovels shared and water jugs nearby for rinsing. Discipline extended even to waist. It was a weapon of precision, meant to find the gap between ribs, not swing dramatically. It was what separated them from barbarian hordes. Discipline, repetition, reliability. He'd worked with barrels, soaked staves, and tied hoops. It was a simple life, but steady, of a tent that blew away with someone still inside it, of a prank involving a goat and a Roman helmet. The laughter was tired but real. He hadn't planned to join the legions, but his brother had died in the Danube campaign. and their father, grief-stricken, had spoken just one sentence. Salt was the difference between meat and rot, between a soldier's worth and his failure. It preserved more than food, it preserved the army itself. Did Lucius ever wonder if he'd be remembered? Or was the act of survival enough? Scars, stubble, quiet eyes. No heroes here, just men who had marched through dust and blood for years. For their salt, their pay, and maybe deep down a sense of belonging. Even the iron hobnails on boots were examined. If a man's boot failed mid-march, he was expected to fix it. Himself no complaints. It was clumsy at first. The shields were heavy, the timing precise. But when it worked, it was like walking as a single beast of iron and wood. A broken boot was not a reason to fall behind. It was a test. Tall pines, needles underfoot, the smell of resin and damp bark. Shadows played tricks here. Every movement in the underbrush made. Young recruits jump, but Lucius just walked. After enough campaigns, you stopped flinching at branches. But there were other duties. Before marching, Lucius and a few others were selected for latrine digging detail. After the latrines came gear checks. Every gladius was inspected, scabbards cleaned of dust and sweat. He was thinking of the last village they'd passed through, where a woman had handed him a bundle of herbs with a shy nod. He had no idea what they were, some kind of calming root, perhaps, but he kept them in his bag. Not for use, just for the gesture. By mid-morning, the column moved again, this time toward a small village that had a Greco-Roman persuasion to provide supplies. As they approached, Lucius adjusted the strap of his pack. In the village square, a few elders waited, arms folded, eyes sharp. The centurion stepped forward, scroll in hand. Lucius and his fellows were instructed to wait by the well, near a fig tree. The villagers brought bread and water and placed them on a low table. Lucius watched a boy, maybe 8 or 9, play with a carved wooden figure. That smile reminded Lucius of home, before the army. He'd been a cooper's apprentice. Go take his place, and so he had. After the resupply, the soldiers moved on. The road bent east, then into a low forest. At the camp that evening, the cohort prepared for training exercises. Not even long marches excused them from drills. They formed testudo tortoise, formation locking shields overhead and to the sides, practicing movement under imaginary arrows. Then came sword drills. Short bursts, stab, not slash. The Roman gladius wasn't made for show. Lucius' arms ached after the 5th repetition. Still, he continued, the drill was the heart of the Roman legion. After the session, they were dismissed. The sky had dimmed. Fires were lit. That night, Lucius sat with a few veterans. They shared stories, not heroic ones, but strange ones. Of a pig that stole bread from a centurion. He looked around the fire, gazing at each man's face, cast in an orange glow. But in a life of miles and meals, tents and terrain, the campaign season was drawing to a close. Autumn winds whispered through the trees like old voices, and the air turned dry and crisp. Dust from the long summer marshes clung to the seams of Lucius' tunic and gathered in the creases of his face. Leaves browned and drifted lazily onto the military road ahead, and the fires in the Roman encampment burned a little warmer, a little longer each night. The cohort had set up near a river outpost. Nothing strategic, just a border patrol, maintaining Rome's silent watch. The enemy wasn't close. Not today. Not this month. Not for parade, just to keep the rust from eating through. He'd seen too many soldiers let theirs corrode, then fall apart in a skirmish because they thought the world would stay quiet. The real enemy was fatigue, boredom, and the endless erosion of time. His body bore the long memory of camps, battles, blisters, and boots. He remembered when he'd first arrived. Fresh-eyed, his belt too big, and his pack to clean. A warm tile roof, just men walking. Boots on soil, wind in the trees, and the occasional joke passing up the line. No boots. What was there to say? Still marching. The world is wide. I miss figs. Lucius lay beside one of its arches, looking up at the stars. framed perfectly in the open vault above him. Now, the leather was cracked, the wool roughened by sweat, and his fingers stiff when the nights dipped cold. A quiet mission. 2 days' march. No banners, no ceremony. Lucius sat near the fire, polishing his armor with slow, tired motions. Not an uprising, just bandits harassing grain shipments. The kind of minor unrest that didn't make statues but still disrupted Rome's long reach. He was older now, not in years, maybe 35, but his bones said more. They escorted a cart of grain, met with village elders, and stood watch while repairs were made to a road. No skirmishes, no drama, just presence. It was them, the men, who carried it, quietly, mile after mile. This post wasn't his last, but it felt like a pause, a checkpoint. The centurion had hinted at it, perhaps one more year of duty, then consideration for land. Retirement, in the Roman way, came not with fanfare, but with farmland. A quiet reward for decades of service, the kind that turns dry roads into mud and blisters into open sores. Their pace slowed. Lucius' foot caught a root. He fell hard. Nothing was broken, but the pain in his knee refused to ease. He sometimes imagined it. A plot near Naples, a vineyard, maybe a donkey, definitely a wife if fate was kind. But there was still duty to perform, still miles to walk, borders to hold, and orders to follow. The next morning, the cohort received a message. A delegation from a nearby town had requested assistance. Lucius' unit was dispatched. They walked lightly. No tents, just cloaks and spears, a few days' rations, and their shield. Lucius liked these marshes best. No drills, no horns. That night, they camped near a half-collapsed aqueduct. A marvel once, now forgotten. Vines crept through the cracks in its stones. He pulled out the small wax tablet again, scratched a line, then paused. He chuckled, closed it. In the darkness, a younger soldier nearby asked Lucius, "Do you think we'll ever go home?" Lucius didn't answer right away. He listened to the river nearby, the soft snoring of a tentmate, and the creak of leather. "We never left," he said finally. "Rome is where your boots are." It wasn't meant as wisdom, it was just what he believed. The empire wasn't marble columns or distant senators. The mission itself was uneventful, but on the way back, rain caught him. Cold, slicing rain. Back at camp, the medicus inspected it. Ligament strain. Rest it. Walk less. Lucius laughed. Walk less. In the Roman army, he wrapped a knee with a strip of linen and dipped it in warm vinegar. He wouldn't complain, but it stayed sore. Each march now came with a limp, and with it, a realization. His time was near. He sent word to his superiors, asked about the land grant. One placed a small clay figure in his bag of donkey, grinning. They approved. Tied the old salt pouch shut, not with salt inside now, but with dry rosemary and dried slices of garlic. A soldier sent back. His years served were enough. The records were filed. One last winter, and then freedom. Tents like dull beetles. Rows of shields propped against poles. Smoke curling from fires. And men who would carry on, march forward, add their footprints to his. But his name is carved into the very roads he walked, repeated in the ruts, the routines. The footprints turned to dust. He packed slowly, one cool morning in late February, folded his blanket, stored his wax tablet. The men stood in a line. They didn't salute, not for someone leaving on foot, but they nodded. He smiled at that. Lucius left the camp the way he had entered it years ago, quietly, on foot, with dust rising behind him. No fanfare, no music, just the wind and the weight of a pack. As he crested the first hill, he looked back. Lucius turned and walked down the hill. He was never written about in Roman records. No monuments, no triumphal arches. But how many empires were truly built not by emperors but by weary, limping men like Lucius, paid not in glory, but in salt? Settle in, listener. The fire is low, the night is quiet, and it's time to descend not into the halls of war or the courts of kings, but into the cracks and crevices beneath them. Tonight's tale is not about generals or poets, but about those who made royal life slightly more bearable. But everyone knew they were there. We begin in England, sometime in the early 18th century, between the powdered wigs of Queen Anne's court and the steady rule of George II. The palace was grand, of course. Gilded ceilings, ornate tapestries, imported marble, but beneath all that splendor, rats. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them. No one spoke of them in polite company. He was wiry, quiet, and had the kind of stillness that let him blend into stone walls. His coat was thick brown wool, patched in places. His boots were scuffed. His tools, however, were polished with use. Wire traps, long-handled tongs, a pouch of chalk dust. He'd tie a bit of bacon to a string, stretch it across a narrow shelf, and watch from the shadows as the trap snapped. No formal meetings, just the scribbled notes on parchment. 10. Caught beneath the pastries. Activity near the steward's larder persists. Suggests setting night traps. Sometimes he used poisoned oats, though only in places well away from the kitchen. He was careful not to upset the cooks, and a walking stick hollowed at one end to store dried herbs and rat poison. They scurried beneath the kitchen tiles, nested behind wood paneling, and darted from corners during midnight walks. They were bold, smart, and extremely hungry. Even royal ships, before they launched from port, had to be inspected. Rats aboard meant chewed, rigging, ruined stores, and potential plague. They could sniff out nests, chase down runners, and dig beneath floorboards with astonishing speed. To palace staff, their high-pitched barking was as familiar as the footman's calls. Worse, droppings had been found in a flour barrel. The Queen's tart had been ruined. Grain, cheese, meat scraps, candle wax. Nothing was safe. Wearing gloves, he examined the crates. Sure enough, rat teeth sharp, grooves, precise, likely multiple animals. He traced a thin trail of flour across the stone floor. It disappeared under a barrel of salted fish. Cellars. Tonight, read the note. These weren't the romantic dungeons of novels. They were functional. Low, damp. Everyone remembered stories of fleas, rats, and swelling sores. Thomas did too. His grandfather had lived through it. It was why he took his job seriously. Kitchen maids nodded. Guards greeted him with curt respect. No one wanted his job, but they were grateful he did it. Only a small note tucked under a kitchen jar. Issue resolved. Suggest resealing flour crates. The torches flickered. Somewhere above, a courtier sneezed. The terriers rested at his feet. The Queen's tart, version 2, was declared satisfactory by lunch. A rat in the wrong place wasn't just a nuisance. It could be a catastrophe. And 2 dogs walked the halls no one spoke of, and filled with barrels of wine, sacks of flour, and crates of salted meat. It was the rat's paradise. Notes on strange behaviors. How rats avoided copper surfaces. How they traveled in patterns. How certain types of cheese seemed to draw them faster than others. One entry simply read, "Large black rat in the tapestry hallway bold. Fast and clever. Watched me. Will return tomorrow with glue board." But he had papers signed by the keeper of the privy purse and the Lord Steward himself. He looked not just for the rats themselves, but for signs droppings, scratches, disturbed dust, missing grain. A skilled rat catcher didn't just chase. He read the room like a map. His post was official. He served the crown directly, though no trumpet ever heralded his arrival. They chewed through linen, spoiled food supplies, and even once gnawed through the leather strap of a duke's ceremonial boot. And so, in the shadows of monarchy, there existed an unlikely yet vital role. The royal rat catcher. His name was Thomas Griggs. He did not wear a powdered wig. He did not dine with nobility. Thomas was not a young man, nor was he particularly imposing. Each morning, he began in the cellars. Thomas walked with a quiet step, lantern held low. Edie sprinkled chalk dust along doorways and come back hours later to see a footprints had passed through. He reported findings weekly to the master of the household. His work extended beyond the palace itself. Stables, servants' quarters, garden sheds. Yes, plague was still feared, though the Great Plague of 1665 had passed. Londoners remained wary. He kept journals, careful records of each infestation, drawings of different traps he'd improved. He was not without help. 2 terriers, trained since birth, followed him on rotation. Pip and Buttons. Thomas wasn't loved, but he was respected. Servants stepped aside when he passed. One autumn evening, the royal baker reported that a crate of apples had been nibbled through. One by one, Thomas was summoned not through ceremony, but with urgency. He arrived after dusk. When the palace had quieted, he moved it aside. A small hole in the wall. Too small for a cat, too obscure for a casual guard to notice. Perfect. He returned with tools, laid 3 traps, 1 glue board, and a tiny pouch of smoked cheese. Then he waited. Then a soft scrape, a twitch of movement. Snap. He retrieved the trap. 1 large rat, black-furred and heavy. The others would come later. They always did. By morning, 6 were caught. Thomas left no report that day. But how many such crises passed silently? How many meals were saved? Ships spared? Diseases avoided because a quiet man with a lantern? Thomas Griggs was not noble, but he held a kind of power, a subtle one, in a palace obsessed with appearances, where every surface shimmered under candlelight, and every corridor echoed with powdered shoes and political whispers. Thomas operated in the quiet margins, and in those margins he was unmatched. As autumn deepened, so did the rats' boldness, but everyone knew they were there. Colder nights meant they pressed deeper into the walls, beneath the hearths, and through storerooms long sealed. Grain shipments arrived, damp, and the rodents ever opportunistic took note. Settle in, listener. The fire is low, the night is quiet, and it's time to descend not into the halls of war or the courts of kings, but into the cracks and crevices beneath them. He did not wear a powdered wig. They were functional, low, damp, and filled with barrels of wine, sacks of flour, and crates of salted meat. It was the rat's paradise. He did not dine with nobility, but he had papers signed by the keeper of the privy purse and the Lord Steward himself. His post was official. He looked not just for the rats themselves, but for sign stroppings, scratches, disturbed dust, missing grain. He'd tie a bit of bacon to a string, stretch it across a narrow shelf, and watch from the shadows as the traps snapped. Sometimes he used poisoned oats, though only in places well away from the kitchen. He was careful not to upset the cooks. Everyone remembered stories of fleas, rats, and swelling sores. Thomas did, too. His grandfather had lived through it. It was why he took his job seriously. A rat in the wrong place wasn't just a nuisance. It could be a catastrophe. Even royal ships, before they launched from port, had to be inspected, but they were grateful he did it. Worse, droppings had been found in a flour barrel. Cellars. Tonight, read the note. The Queen's tart had been ruined. Sure enough, rat teeth, sharp grooves, precise, likely multiple animals. He traced a thin trail of flour across the stone floor. It disappeared under a barrel of salted fish. Rats aboard meant chewed rigging, ruined stores, and potential plague. A skilled rat catcher didn't just chase. He read the room like a map, laid 3 traps, 1 glue board, and a tiny pouch of smoked cheese. Then he waited. No formal meeting, just a scribbled note on parchment. 10 caught beneath the pastries. Activity near the stewards. Lauder persists. Suggests setting night traps. He served the crown directly, though no trumpet ever heralded his arrival. Tonight's tale is not about generals or poets, but about those who made royal life slightly more bearable. Pip and Buttons. They could sniff out nests, chase down runners, and dig beneath floorboards with astonishing speed. The palace staff. Their hyped sparking was as familiar as the footman's calls. We begin in England, sometime in the early 18th century, between the powdered wigs of Queen Anne's court and the steady rule of George II. The torches flickered. Somewhere above, Accordia sneezed. The terriers rested at his feet. Notes on strange behaviors: how rats avoided copper surfaces, how they traveled in patterns, how certain types of cheese seemed to draw them faster than others. One entry. Simply read: large black rat in the tapestry hallway bold. Will return tomorrow with glue board. The palace was grand. Of course, the Queen's tart, version 2, was declared satisfactory by lunch. Gilded ceilings, ornate tapestries, imported marble. Nor was he particularly imposing. Only a small note tucked under a kitchen jar. Issue resolved. Suggest resealing flower crates. He was wiry, quiet, and had the kind of stillness that let him blend into stone walls. His coat was thick brown wool, patched in places. His boots were scuffed. His tools, however, were polished with use. Wire traps, long-handled tongs, a pouch of chalk dust, and a walking stick hollowed at one end to store dried herbs and rat poison. But beneath all that splendor, rats. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them. No one spoke of them in polite company. They scurried beneath the kitchen tiles, nested behind wood paneling, and darted from corners during midnight walks. They were bold, smart, and extremely hungry. Grain, cheese, meat scraps, candle wax, nothing was safe. They chewed through linen, spoiled food supplies, and even once gnawed through the leather strap of a duke's ceremonial boot. And so, in the shadows of monarchy, there existed an unlikely yet vital role. The royal rat catcher. His name was Thomas Griggs. Thomas was not a young man. Each morning, he began in the cellars. These weren't the romantic dungeons of novels. Thomas walked with a quiet step, lantern held low. He sprinkled chalk dust along doorways, and come back hours later to see if footprints had passed through. He reported findings weekly to the master of the household. His work extended beyond the palace itself. Stables, servants' quarters, garden sheds. Yes, plague was still feared. Though the Great Plague of 1665 had passed, Londoners remained wary. He kept journals, careful records of each infestation, drawings of different traps he'd improved. He was not without help. 2 terriers, trained since birth, followed him on rotation. Thomas wasn't loved, but he was respected. Servants stepped aside when he passed. Kitchen maids nodded. Guards greeted him with curt respect. No one wanted his job. One autumn evening, the royal baker reported that a crate of apples had been spoiled, nibbled through. One by one, Thomas was summoned not through ceremony, but with urgency. He arrived after dusk, when the palace had quieted. Wearing gloves, he examined the crates. He moved it aside, a small hole in the wall. Too small for a cat, too obscure for a casual guard to notice. Perfect. He returned with tools. Hours passed. Then a soft scrape, a twitch of movement. Snap. He retrieved the trap. One large rat, black-furred and heavy. The others would come later. They always did. By morning, 6 were caught. Thomas left no report that day. But how many such crises passed silently? How many meals were saved, ships spared, and diseases avoided because a quiet man with a lantern and 2 dogs walked the halls no one spoke of? One evening, the underbutler approached Thomas with a red face and a whispered tone. Dave had been spotted in the Queen's drawing room. Thomas paused mid-step. How many? If rats reached royal upholstery, it became more than a nuisance. It became a risk to dignity, a stain on the very idea of monarchy. Chased the maid. One leapt onto the velvet curtains. The under-butler gulped. Curtains were serious. That night, Thomas inspected the room personally. The Queen's drawing room was a sanctuary of pale gold brocade, floral silk chairs, and candle sconces polished twice daily. He baited it with suet. Rats loved suet. Too much. In fact, each plump from palace indulgence. He moved slowly, lamp held at waist level. He was careful not to scuff the floor or breathe too loudly. He looked beneath the chaise long, found a trail faint, oily marks on the wooden floor. They'd patched the wall discreetly. No one would mention the incident in court gossip. He followed it to the far corner, where a gap behind a carved wall panel had gone unnoticed. Scratches along the wood confirmed his suspicion. An entry point. A rat had chewed through a casket's contents, fouled with droppings, were served unknowingly at a banquet. The fallout was severe. He returned the next night, tools in hand. Not poisons this time, but a collapsible snare made of hair-thin copper wire, nearly invisible. Budgeted. Authorized. Sometimes resented, but always maintained. Someone who would inspect, trap, and prevent. He remembered following him through damp basements, holding a lantern while his uncle reset spring-loaded traps and muttered about tail width and nesting behavior. Quietly, thoroughly, unnoticed. He hid in the adjacent room, listening through the plaster. He heard them. Inspection at dawn. Notes by a prized violin case had been found, chewed at the base. The prince was incensed not because of the case itself, but because of the implication that his rooms were not sealed from the animal world. Repairs after noon. Trap resets before dusk. Another time, he used beeswax to plug a hole, masked it with and watched as the rodents tried to chew through it, only to be trapped on the glue board placed beside it. Together, they had cleared entire wings of the palace. Once, at a royal banquet, Thomas received word of movement under the desert cart. He observed things others didn't: shifts in temperature between rooms, signs of water damage that might attract pests, and a way a rat might chew only one corner of a bag. With a single gesture, Buttons had wriggled beneath the linen and emerged seconds later with a limp tail in his jaws. 3 removed. Knew when bait was too good to be true. Some had even figured out how to spring traps without getting caught. Entry point. Behind portrait alcove. Evidence of nesting. Recommend repairs and floor inspection within a soft pause, skittering, whispery squeaks, then twang. By midnight, he had caught 3. He recorded the incident in his private log. Queen's drawing room. Palace workmen would come the next day. Across the estates of Britain, large households had vermin officers, Mausers, or simply Old Ned, who knew about rats, but few held official appointments. But that's how Thomas preferred it. There were others like him. Of course, not in name, but in practice. Thomas did. His post had originated decades earlier, when an infestation in Whitehall had resulted in the king's prized wine being spoiled and several dignitaries falling ill. From that scandal was born the idea of a designated professional, a man not of nobility, but of necessity. Over time, the royal rat-catcher became a real role. Thomas had inherited the post from his uncle, who had trained him since age 12. He'd learned early that rats were clever, smarter than most gave them credit for. They adapted quickly, but he had tricks too. He once created a decoy sent Lindragon, a strip of salted cloth through flour, to mislead a family of rats away from a pantry. And of course, there were the dogs. Pip had grown old now, his muzzle graying. Buttons, younger and more erratic, had energy to spare. The guests applauded. No one mentioned it again. Thomas kept to his routine. He rarely spoke, unless spoken to, but he watched. One rainy day, he was summoned to inspect the prince's private quarters. Thomas arrived quietly, inspected, found the evidence, set a trap. He never spoke to the prince, but 2 days later, a footman delivered a sealed note. Inside, a single sentence. Your silence is appreciated more than your success, though. Both are valued. It was the closest thing to praise he ever received. But in a palace of whispers and polished wood, where titles glittered and names rose and fell with fashion, was there not something noble, even dignified, in being the man who saw what no one else wished to see? Winter brought silence to the palace. The halls grew colder, fires burned lower, snow drifted quietly against tall windows, muffling the sounds of footmen's boots and rustling skirts. In this stillness, most of the court turned inward, nobles to their salons, servants to their hearts, and rats to the warmth of the walls. The rats had become bold again, and Thomas, older than he liked to admit, felt it in his bones. Buttons paced restlessly now, without his companion, unsettled, barking more than usual, digging anxiously beneath flagstones. He could still tell the difference between Norway rats and black rats by the shape of the droppings, still new. By smell alone, if an infestation had reached the pantry, it was always Thomas's busiest season. Rodents, like people, sought comfort. These cellars, once cool and musty, now offered the soft insulation of stacked burlap and the tempting scent of aged cheeses. Pip had passed quietly one night in November, curled beside the hearth. Thomas worked alone more often now. He moved slower, his knees protesting each stare, but his mind was as sharp as ever. One morning, a kitchen maid pulled him aside. He knelt near the stone steps leading to the altar and pressed his ear to the floor. They'd been heard in the Queen's chapel, the idea that rats crept beneath the stones, chewing at the wood of the altar base, was almost laughably sad. And yet, Thomas nodded and set out without delay. He raised an eyebrow. Above the altar, no, she whispered. Beneath it, a mother, sleek and alert, hissed once before disappearing into a crack he hadn't yet seen. That was new. The chapel was meant to be untouched, sacred, solemn, silent. He entered from the side corridor, careful not to disturb the sacristy. The air was cold but dry. A tangle of ancient boards and cobwebbed masonry surrounded him. He moved with the patience of a man who knew his prey well. A pause, then soft, very soft, a scraping sound. They were there. He returned that night, after evening prayers, with tools wrapped in a canvas roll and a small tin of smoked meat. The crawl space beneath the chapel was low. He had to duck to fit by candlelight. He found the nest, 5 young rats, tucked into the base of a cracked beam. He set the traps in a circle, not to kill them all at once. He knew better than to be greedy, but enough to send a message. By morning, 3 were caught, the other 2 vanished and did not return. A quiet victory. He left a small note for the chaplain. Activity under the altar resolved. Beam repair advised before spring. No signature, just his mark. A single scratched line, shaped like a rat's tail curling into a circle. In the spring, a new steward arrived young, polished and fresh from Cambridge. He was full of reforms and enthusiasm, eager to modernize palace operation. He found Thomas's record shelves of handwritten journals, oil-smudged logs, and annotated These should be consolidated, he declared. Streamlined, he summoned Thomas to his office, offered him parchment to transcribe the records and a scribe to help if needed. Spoke of updating the position, perhaps renaming it Facilities Sanitation Manager, he suggested, as if that might grant dignity. Thomas said nothing. After a pause, the steward added, "You've served the palace with distinction, but times are changing." Thomas simply nodded. That evening, he packed his bag as he had every night for over 20 years. The kind of silence he liked, that's not born of fear, but of a job well done. The young dog would be restless now, unused to stillness, but he would adapt. But this time, he left his trap keys on the table. Inside, a worn leather pouch with old traps, a flask of peppermint oil, and a parchment journal tied in string. He did one final round through the cellars, lit a candle, walked slowly. No rats tonight, just silence. He simply stopped coming. The traps, once checked weekly, were left to gather dust. The chalk lines on the floor, faded, name unclear, may have served during Queen Anne or George II. Records are extensive. Position phased out during modernization. Buttons followed him closely. Thomas didn't leave a resignation. The palace, so grand above, forgot the quiet man who had guarded its underbelly for decades. Years later, during a renovation of the chapel, workmen uncovered a sealed crawlspace, filed it away, made a note in the archive. On the inside cover was written, "To catch what creeps is not to kill it only, but to know it where it hides, why it runs, and what it fears." It was signed T.G. No one knew who that was, but the royal historian kept the journal. private pest control officer, 18th century. That was all. But somewhere, under the echo of royal halls, did the old floorboards still carry the memory of the man who kept their corners clear? Good evening, friend. If your eyes are growing heavy, let your thoughts drift now to an older Paris knot, the golden balconies of Versailles, or the marble halls of kings. Yet behind the stately facades and candlelit salons lies a world of hard labor that supported it all domestic workers, laundresses, and water haulers. In a modest tenement in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, a woman named Margot was already awake. She stretched her arms, cracked her knuckles, and glanced toward the pile of linen that waited near the door. It wasn't hers. It belonged to the household where she worked tablecloths, petticoats, aprons, and chemise, soiled from meals, dust, and the city's constant grime. It was nothing grand, just a low wooden structure with a sloping roof, open to the air, with channels for the river to flow beneath the slats. Boards were set into the floor to kneel upon. Flat stones lined the washing troughs, and on laundry day, they all converged along the Seine. Less if you were poor. For Margot, it meant rising before the bells of St. Paul's told the hour, hoisting a wooden yoke across her shoulders. Madame will sniff if the lace yellows again, and balancing 2 full buckets of clothes, already soaked in lye water overnight. Her arms, lean and strong from years of repetition, knew the rhythm well. Others used beating sticks to pound heavier items, bedding, wool, or rugs. A rhythm emerged. Slap, scrub, rinse, twist, slap, scrub, rinse, twist. Occasionally someone cursed as their sleeve dipped into the icy water. First came the scrubbing each garment, laid across a plank, doused in river water, and worked with a bar of soap. She pressed hard with the flat of her hands, her fingers red in minutes from cold and friction. But the washhouses and riverbanks, where another kind of work shaped the rhythm of the day. The year is 1662. Paris hums with the activity of tradesmen, street criers, and carriages jostling for space. It was still early. Fog hung over the water, soft and low, blurring the edges of the city. Despite the cold, Margot's brow glistened. Others swore by adding powdered eggshell to the soap. For bloodstains, a mixture of vinegar and ashes. For wine, goat milk, and salt. Some had carts. Others bore bundles wrapped in oilcloth. Their hands were cracked, their nails rimmed with chalk. But they were swift, efficient, and no one dared use another woman's soapstone without asking. By midday, the air was heavy with damp cloth and chatter. Some women began hanging finished pieces along ropes strung between posts, the linen flapping gently like flags of surrender. There were greetings, quick and practical. She twisted it tightly, her shoulders straining. Water poured out in small streams, forming icy rivulets at her feet. He waited at the edge, careful not to step on any soaked garments. Slap, scrub, rinse, twist. Laundry day came once every 10 days. More often if your household had guests. She sat back on her heels, stretching her neck and shaking out her hands. Did she dare? Her skin burned from the cold and the soap. Her nails were split, but the cloth gleamed. It smelled of effort, not perfume. That would come later, when scented waters or pressed starch were applied inside the house. Her hands were raw. Before she even reached the water, the communal washhouse, or lavoir, stood along the quieter bend of the Seine. Already, other women had arrived. Better. Margot offered a small nod. Quiet praise was rare but earned. Cold this morning. Left my soap roots soaking overnight, might not need to boil. There were no sweet floral perfumes. Here only the clean sting of alkaline and steam. Got your chalk block. Tools were set out. Paddles, washboards, handfuls of ash or chalk, and rough soaps, made from animal fat. Margot rolled up her sleeves. Once scrubbed garments were rinse-dipped and swirled in fast-flowing water. Some laundresses hauled fresh water with pails, pouring it over cloth, stretched out on wide boards. Margot worked steadily, mouth tight, breath puffing, visibly in the air. It wasn't silent, but it was focused, a chorus of labor. Buckets sloshed, boards creaked, women muttered. One woman, a newcomer, knocked a soap bar into the river. There was laughter, good-natured. Fish'll be clean today. Over time, steam began to rise, not from fires there, were none, but from the friction, the breath, and the heat of exertion. There were tricks passed down between women to whiten linen. Some laid it in the frost after washing, letting sunlight and cold bleach it naturally. Margot knew them all. She moved to wring the water from a large tablecloth. Nearby, older women leaned into their work with gritted teeth and stiff backs. One young girl fumbled a blouse. "Don't twist it like rope," an older woman snapped. "It'll tear at the seam." "Roll it," the girl tried again. There was hierarchy, even here. Senior laundresses claimed the best boards. Apprentices fetched more water. As the sun rose higher, the wash house grew crowded. A man arrived with a cart paid by a wealthy household to retrieve freshly cleaned laundry. Margot saw him eyeing her pile. She moved faster. By early afternoon, her load was nearly done. She packed the damp garments carefully into her sack. They would dry by the fire overnight. She'd press them tomorrow. Delivery came Thursday. As she lifted the yoke across her shoulders once more, she paused. Around her, the wash house was still in full rhythm. Same as always. Same as it had been for generations. But as Margot turned back toward the steep hill leading home, her arms aching, one might wonder, did she ever imagine a day when laundry didn't mean rivers and frostbitten fingers? Back in her modest quarters, on the upper floor of a merchant's townhouse, Margot hung the damp linen with care. The rafters of the laundry room, warmed faintly by a nearby hearth, held to long wooden poles strung with twine. The room smelled of damp wool, soap, and faintly of smoke from the kitchen below. Outside, frost still clung to the rooftops of Paris. But within these quiet walls, the final steps of laundry day had begun. Each piece had its place. Shirts hung by the cuffs so the seams wouldn't stretch. Tablecloths were folded in half and draped over clean rods. That was for washerwomen. With no fire, no space, it had to breathe slowly, like bread rising. Her fingers were wrapped in strips of cloth, makeshift bandages against sly burns and split nails. She sipped a weak broth from a tin mug. Her body ached in familiar places. Shoulders, wrists, and the arches of her feet. Here, indoors, it dried slowly, deliberately, away from soot and birds and sudden rain. Others preferred simple rectangles. The starch-boiled wheat or potato paste, sometimes infused with lavender, was brushed on beforehand, making the fabric dry, stiff, and whispery. Margot's arm moved in steady arcs, applying pressure, releasing steam. It smelled warm and clean. A quiet reward after the slap and sting of the aprons are pressed at the waist, not the bodice. Lace collars were laid with a strip of parchment inside so they wouldn't collapse. Undergarments, those fragile cotton shifts, and silk-lined corset covers were pinned at their thickest points to avoid tearing. Margot had once been fined for folding a table napkin with the crest inside instead of outside. She never made that mistake again. This was the part most of Paris never thought about. She kept a sewing kit, nearby needles, silk thread, and buttons stripped from old garments. She stitched fast, her fingers moving, even as her eyes began to blur from fatigue. When a noble lady slipped into a starched chemise, or dined beneath a crisply folded cloth, she never paused to wonder how it became so pristine. But Margot knew every pleat, every stiffness, every soft folded was no accident. Margot moved among the garments like a curator tending to a delicate collection. In households of means, like the one she worked for, wet laundry was never left outside to dry, washed again. Smells of starch, she'd learned from experience, that rushing the process ruined cloth. Damp linen, folded too soon, molded, dried too fast. It stiffened. She would rewash it, reline it, just for a moment. And when she saw the silverware aligned on her freshly pressed cloth, she would feel It not glory, not satisfaction exactly, but something like completion. Repress it. A neighboring rooftop caught the golden edge of the sunset. Smoke curled from chimneys. There rarely was any, but because she had pride in the work. A strange pride, a private one. She spotted another laundress across the courtyard shaking out a sheet, arms stretched, her silhouette framed in the glow. Once everything was hung, Margot sat on a low stool by the hearth, but Margot remained in her small, warm room, smoothing the wrinkles of lives. She did not live. They were solid metal, no handles of wood or fancy mechanics, heated in the coals, then tested on a scrap of paper to check for scorching. But there was still work to do. By mid-morning the next day, the linens were dry enough for finishing. She brought out her pressing tools. 2 irons, one small and pointed, the other broader and heavier. No thermostats, just instinct. She ironed with long, even strokes. No creases unless requested. Some clients liked their napkins folded like birds or fans. Each item was pressed flat on a thick linen pad. Mist rose in gentle clouds from the table. By early afternoon, she began folding. Not loosely, not lazily. Folding was a skill. Shirts tucked at the seam. In aristocratic households, laundresses were sometimes given strict folding diagrams. She stacked each item into a neat pile, secured with ribbon or twine, and tagged with a small slip of parchment written in her own hand. For Madame L. Thursday dinner. Lace collar reinforced. Monsieur H3 shirts, repaired seam noted. She checked every stitch, every hem. Even the smallest tear was mended. Outside, bells rang the evening hour. Paris was settling into its nightly rhythm. Bakeries closing, taverns lighting candles, and horses clattering back to stables. As she finished, she paused to glance out the narrow window. A quiet kinship. They didn't speak, but they both understood. Later, as Margot delivered the pressed stack to the main floor, she was greeted not by thanks, but by instructions. The master's guests have changed their arrival, the housekeeper said, not looking up. They'll need the large tablecloth by tomorrow. Margot nodded. She said nothing. She would not argue, not for the thanks. She would walk past the dining room, tomorrow, as she often did, and glance in. But when the linens were soiled again, when the fine guests spilled wine or gravy or candle waxed at anyone, remember the hands that had once lifted them, wrung them, and folded them with care. It was Thursday again, in a city that spun around courtly routines, feast schedules, and the tides of fashion. Laundry kept its own calendar steady, invisible, and endlessly repeating. Paris breathed through silk gowns and powdered wigs, but it stood on buckets of water, sacks of lye, and the cracked hands of women like Margot. The footman barely glanced at her as she passed. This morning, as snow melted into the gutters and the roofs dripped like broken fountains, she carried the pressed and bundled stack to her employer's grand parlor. The housekeeper arrived a few minutes later. Inspecting the seams without comment, she nodded. Briefly, she placed the parcels carefully on a sideboard, each tagged and arranged just so. That will be all. Her hands were bandaged again, this time from a slip, while pinning lace to the pressboard. A fresh gash ran from the top of her palm to her knuckle, raw and pink. And it was. Margot turned and left, but her work remained folded, invisible, foundational. She had once thought about becoming a seamstress, but laundry was steadier, always needed. No seasons, no fashion whims, only dirt, and the need to remove it. Back in her own quarter, the air was quiet. The fire smoldered. She soaked them in a basin of cool vinegar water and it stung, but she barely flinched. Her fingers were not elegant. The joints were thickened, her nails short and permanently rimmed with the ghosts of soap. In the far alleyway, 2 other laundresses passed by, carrying steaming baskets wrapped in cloth. They moved quickly, shoulders bent. Now she paced herself, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. It held pages and pages of names, dates, stain notes, and starch recipes. She flipped back through the last year, She dipped a rag into the mixture and began wiping the irons, polishing them with a piece of rough linen until they shone again. She reached for her ledger-worn leather, stained and soft to the touch. Madame E refuses vinegar and rinse water. Another woman, Jean, was there, folding napkins on a bench. Monsieur D prefers trousers folded lengthwise, not at the knee. Silk trim removed 4 separate pressing C-pinned tags, but it mattered. She always had. But her smile was genuine. Even the invisible work required memory. Every detail is remembered. No one asked her to keep such records. A woman in Rue Montorgueil who'd sing while pressing sheets too loudly. Some said, outside, laundry hung on the neighbor's line frozen. Stiff like sails on a docked ship. Margot used to walk that fast. She boiled a pot of water and poured it over dried herbs, rosemary, lemon peel, and soapwort root. The scent filled the room, softening the air. Tools mattered. Even if the world didn't see your face, it remembered your touch. And that touch had to be clean, practiced, and ready. By mid-afternoon, she visited the communal courtyard to retrieve a stray loaned apron. Who scraped and scrubbed and pressed the filth from beauty. Who labored not for applause but so the world above could shine. She worked slowly repairing a fraying hem on her own sleeve. A candle flickered beside her. Or will their stories, like steam, rise and vanish known only in the scent of starch and the softness of freshly dried cloth? The city murmured beneath her feet, carriages on cobblestones, bells from distant churches, the faint cry of a baby through an open shutter. The guests who would never know her name, the way she had watched silk transform from limp to proud under her iron. No, nobles don't know how to fold fitted sleeves. Delivery tomorrow? Jean asked. Saturday, Margot replied. New family. Doctor's household. 6 children. Jean whistled. They must bathe in flour. They both laughed. Not loudly, but it was laughter still. They spoke of lye prices. A friend with a new boil pot. Margot listened more than she spoke. Want some rosemary starch? She offered, gesturing to a wrapped bundle in her basket. Enough for 3 shirts. Jean raised an eyebrow. What's the trade? Nothing, Margot said. It's Thursday. You look tired. Jean accepted with a grin. You should have been born noble. Margot shook her head. That evening, she settled at the window with her stitching. Paris was never quiet, but sometimes it softened. She thought about the linens she'd pressed, the stains she'd erased, and the things she'd touched that would touch others. It was thankless, repetitive, exhausting, but not meaningless. Each clean shirt, each folded napkin was an act of care, a reply to chaos, an invisible form of dignity. And as the candle burned low and her eyes grew heavy, she imagined a world where someone, somewhere, would remember the women who worked beside the water. But will history ever lift their names from the ledgers and soap bins? Good evening, as you lay your head down tonight on a modern pillow, perhaps with soft sheets tucked just right, let your thoughts slow and drift far backward before the age of memory foam. Before box springs, even before the word mattress became common. Tonight, we explore how the world once slept. Candles are costly, so most light is faded with the sun. Nothing ornate, just for posts, sometimes with rope or canvas webbing stretched across for support. Upon it lies a sleeping surface, not a mattress, but a palace, a large sack stuffed with straw, hay, or reeds. The hearth still smolders, glowing softly, its smoke curling into the rafters. Some homes used hay, but it attracted insects. Others, near riverbanks, might stuff their bedding with dried rucha softer, with a gentle scent when warmed by body heat. The room smells faintly of ash, wool, and the damp scent of earthen floors. Our journey begins in a small cottage on the edge of a forest, somewhere in 14th century Northern Europe. The sky has long since darkened. Others used wooden headrests, carved to support the neck. In colder regions, furs were added on top, sometimes held in place by tucking them under ropes strung along the side of the bed frame. Sometimes a mat of rushes, or even just loose straw, is spread in a corner. Children were bundled close, sharing body heat in wealthier homes. Servants might sleep in trunks or chests, curled into narrow spaces. In parts of Asia and Africa, these wooden or ceramic headrests were both functional and decorative. Cool in warm climates, and it was a literal instruction. Tighten the bed cords, or the support would sag. First sleep lasted from dusk until midnight. Then they would wake sometimes for an hour or more, stir the fire, say prayers, talk, even visit neighbors or complete chores. Then came second sleep, lasting until dawn. In the center of the single room, a bedstead, a wooden frame raised slightly off the ground, a rhythm shaped by candlelight, circadian biology, and a world with fewer artificial cues. Then, perhaps, a featherbed. If you were lucky or rich, featherbeds were filled with down, stitched into large fluffed panels. Kings and queens might have towering four-posters with embroidered canopies, but the stuffing inside still varied. One French noble requested dried rose petals in his another added lavender and marjoram to ward off lice. Others burned incense or powdered the sheets with It helped a little. In medieval London, one featherbed cost more than a month's wages for a skilled tradesman. Colds spread easily, so did plague. On a bed of straw, the wind against wooden shutters, and the scent of sheep's wool in the air. During outbreaks, beds were sometimes burned entirely. In farmhouses, a simple prayer whispered by the fire might mark the transition. It was part of life's rhythm, woven into the fabric of labor and daylight. In cities, night watchmen blew horns or called the hours aloud, a comfort or a warning, depending on your mood. A visiting traveler might sleep on a pallet in the same room. In strangers shared beds, it was expected. You paid for a half bed or a whole bed, not a room. Straw was the most common filler. Inexpensive, dry, and available after every harvest. Sounds carried differently. Animals stirred, wind creaked through shutters. Neighbors coughed or muttered in their sleep. It wasn't comfortable by modern standards. It was lumpy, scratchy, and loud. Turn over once, and the entire room might hear it rustle. The sack was made of coarse linen or wool, often patched many times. In monasteries, beds were assigned with strict discipline, and all lay in their habits. In wealthier households, the bed was layered. First, a bed cord ropes stretched in a grid, tightened with a wooden key. That's where we get the phrase, sleep tight. On top of the ropes, a bedtick, the stuffed sack. Pillows, too, were status symbols. Poor folk used a rolled-up tunic. Some laid their heads directly on the straw. Blankets, most were heavy wool, thick, dark, and scratchy. A large family might share a single one. The poor often slept on the floor itself, especially in crowded cities or rural huts. The very structure of sleep was different, too. Instead of one long, uninterrupted night, people often slept in two phases. This wasn't insomnia, it was routine. Before sleep, rituals varied. In monasteries, monks chanted Compline, final prayer of the day, then filed silently into dormitories. The night wasn't quiet. Privacy was rare. Whole families often shared beds. It was practical space saving. There were rules. Of course, travelers often slept top to tail to avoid awkward intimacy. In royal homes, beds became more elaborate but not necessarily more comfortable. And yes, they were common. The bedding was beaten regularly, hung out to air in the sun. Some households added herbs like wormwood or mint to deter pests. Bed sharing also meant sharing illness. Yet, sleep was deeply respected. It was not hurried, not avoided. And somehow, despite the straw poking ribs, the cold creeping in, or the loud snoring of Uncle Henry 2 feet away, people slept. Not always well, not always comfortably, but deeply. So, tonight, as you rest against your pillow and the fan hums softly in the background, you might wonder, what would it be like to fall asleep beside a glowing hearth? Nightfall came earlier in the past, without street lamps or the glow of screens. Darkness arrived fast and full. It swallowed corners, crept along rafters, and turned even familiar rooms into shapes and shadows. And when darkness ruled, sleep was both escape and necessity. In 17th century villages and 18th century townhouses alike, families built their lives around the natural rhythm of day and night. They rose with the sun and settled when light failed them. But before their eyes closed, a series of nighttime habits, customs, really took place. Embers were banked in the hearth coals, buried under ash to preserve them till morning. The iron poker glowed faintly. Beside it, a kettle or stone jug of hot water steamed softly. Children often shared a pallet on the floor. Servants might sleep in a loft or a hallway. A wet nurse would sleep near the baby, often on the same straw tick. In cottages, this meant crawling into a bed box, a large wooden cabinet with shutters that closed for warmth and privacy. They resembled wardrobes, but held entire families. Inside, darkness pressed close. In winter, breath hung in clouds. The scent was human. Wool, sweat, earth, and the smoke of cooking fires. And one did not remove more than necessary. Families foresighted. Wind howled through thatch roofs. Mice scurried through pantries. Their footsteps, too, marked the rhythm of sleep. Insects emerged from the firewood pile. In colder months, frost formed inside on the walls. A quiet choreography. Others locked the inner door with a wedge and hoped the hinges would hold, followed by a scramble to pass and a trunk of belongings, lest a thief slip them away in the night. Mothers often tied swaddled infants to themselves to prevent rolling onto them, a tragedy feared and whispered about. Doors were barred. Windows shuttered with heavy wooden planks. A traveler might find himself toe-to-toe with a barrel-chested baker or a snoring apothecary, and simply pull the blanket tighter. Furs were piled on top elk, bear, or wolf, depending on what had been hunted or traded. It was layered with meaning. Dreams were read for signs. A vision of water might mean illness. A dream of wolves, a betrayal. Infants were bundled in sheepskin and tucked beside elders for warmth. Then came the bodice. In some parts of Europe, a small blade was tucked under the mattress to ward off evil spirits or prevent bad dreams. One by one, people climbed into their sleeping spaces. Hunters might sleep on pine needles, believing the scent sharpened reef. Sailors placed an anchor-shaped charm beneath their pillows to keep bad luck from following them inland. In larger homes, beds lined the wall. They lay down tired, slept hard, and rose early. Even the wealthy rarely idled in bed. Daylight meant labor, status, and performance. Shared sleeping wasn't just common, it was expected. Husbands and wives, siblings, visiting cousins, and even strangers in roadside inns were often paired into beds to feel the warmth of shared blankets. The itch of straw, the smell of smoke on someone's heret, created a kind of knowing. Imagine a world where the fire is your only warmth, the straw tick your only cushion, and your neighbors breathing the soundtrack to sleep. A closeness rarely spoken of, but deeply felt. Etiquette governed the experience. One kept to one side, one faced outward. One did not speak unless addressed. In many households, the act of sleep was bound with prayer. In Japan, the tatami mat and futon were layered lightly, rolled up in the morning, and stored to reclaim the room for daily use. The phrase, "now I lay me down to sleep," originated from such practices. Not nursery rhyme. Survival. Prayer. The fire, always central, crackled low, and sleep was taken in cycles, shaped by the needs of hunting, weather, or ceremony. Yet sleep was not always peaceful. They rose for midnight. Prayers matins and returned afterward for second sleep. Even in silence, their lives were filled with schedules. Night was not safe. Homes were often poorly sealed. In towns and cities, night was louder. Distant cries, barking dogs, the iron clatter of watchmen's staffs. In medieval cities, the night soil men made their rounds hauling human waste out of tenement homes and tossing it into carts. And then there were the more human dangers. Break-ins, house fires, sudden illness. Some homes kept a wooden club near the bed. Women, in particular, were vulnerable. A girl sharing a servant's bed might tie a cord to her ankle. Despite this, people slept. They found ways. In warmer regions, bedding was light woven mats, grass rolls, or soft cotton sheets laid directly on cool tile. In indigenous North American cultures, bedding was made from hides, moss, or woven reeds, laid in domed dwellings or open-air lodges. In Scandinavia, beds were raised and tucked into corners, and in monastic life, monks slept on simple wooden boards with only a coarse blanket. Sleep, you see, was never just rest. It was seen as a moment of spiritual vulnerability. Some believed that during sleep, the soul wandered. Nightmares were taken seriously. Amulets were hung near beds. Saint medallions, knots of herbs. Superstition wove itself into the mattress stuffing. Midwives recommended lavender, chamomile, or rose petals sewn into infant bedding. But perhaps the most striking thing about pre-modern sleep was how little of it was wasted. Beds weren't made for lounging. They were for a rest essential, unadorned, and brief. People didn't spend hours in bed reading or thinking or watching the day fade. Yet somehow, in all of this, there was a strange intimacy to sleep so close to others, to hear breath change in the dark. So when you close your eyes tonight, tucked into your private room, with soft sheets and a silent thermostat, time passes, and so do customs. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the way people slept began to shift, slowly, subtly, but sleep, once shared and communal, began its long drift toward privacy. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how people worked, it changed how they slept. In cities like London, Paris, and Boston, more people than ever were living in crowded tenements. Factory bells dictated waking hours. Night shifts emerged. Gaslight allowed people to stay up later, and sleep began to shrink. But now, with rising bourgeois ideals of hygiene, virtue, and self-control, sleep was seen differently. Yet strangely, just as people were forced to share space more tightly than ever, the idea of private sleep began to rise. Before, it had been normal, even expected for families, friends, and even strangers to share beds. The ideal sleeper became someone solitary, still, clean. The communal bed slowly gave way to the bedroom. Let's return to a modest, middle-class household in Paris. Circa 8, in the upstairs chamber, behind a door with a polished brass latch, stood a new symbol of respectability. The iron-framed bedstead. Wood was slowly falling out of favor. Iron didn't creak, warp, or play host to lice. Pillows were stuffed with feathers. Blankets, often woven from dyed wool, were chosen for both warmth and aesthetics. This new frame held a firm, woven base, or later, a set of metal springs, topped with a proper mattress. Not straw now, but layers of cotton, wool, or horsehair quilted into shape, stitched into thick ticking fabric, rotated once a week to keep it from sagging. Slippers were left neatly beside the bed. Bed warming pans, metal dishes filled with coals, were tucked under sheets before sleep, then removed to avoid accidents. Bedding had become more refined. Sheets were bleached white and scented. Journals. In parts of Ireland and Wales, box beds like wooden cupboards were built into kitchen walls. In Scandinavia, alcove beds remained popular for their warmth and enclosure. Pocket watches. Sleep became something that happened inside a private ceremony. Parents had their own room, often with twin beds, rather than a shared one, at least in the upper classes. In Japan, futons continued to be laid each night on tatami. In parts of India and the Middle East, rope-woven cut sharpers offered a cool surface for open air. Sleeping, it was where people were born, where they died, where stories were whispered, where bodies shared warmth, where sickness lingered, where hope returned each morning. Pillow-top designs, coil counts, and latex layers all entered the marketplace. Advertised, engineered, marketed as a luxury. not a need. Children slept in separate quarters or in small cots. The bedroom itself was no longer shared by the whole family. The hush of evening and the closing of a door. The peace of letting go. It held their imprint, their scent, their memories. Straw was replaced, and frames were scrubbed. Of firelight flickering nearby. Of a shared silence where sleep was not solitary but communal. An act of endurance and care. Sometimes, salt was scattered on the bare floor to cleanse the space. Privacy became aspirational. Having a room of one's own became tied to dignity, not just space. In working-class homes, of course, bed sharing continued, but now it was spoken of differently. The act of preparing for bed changed too. Instead of crawling into straw, people now folded back turned-down linens, shook out feather pillows, and undressed in the night. In rural villages across Europe and North America, straw ticks were still used, and across the world, sleep continued in diverse forms. In Ethiopia, families still shared mats laid over packed earth, and in colder climates, heated stone beds or Kong systems were built into the architecture itself. Sleep was not one story, but many woven across climates, cultures, and needs. Even so, one thing remained constant. The bed was never just a place of rest. A family might own little a cooking pot, a table, perhaps one fine chair, but a bed, however crude, was treasured. When someone passed, their bed was dismantled, gifted, or burned. In the early 20th century, mass-produced mattresses arrived. Cotton replaced hay. Inner springs were standardized, and sleep became something to purchase. Yet, despite it all, some part of the old world lingered. The sigh as you sink into bed. The rustle of a blanket in the deepest part of night, under the layers of modern softness. Perhaps we still feel the echo of straw rustling beneath us. So tonight, as your sheets wrap softly around you and your head sinks into foam or feather, pause and ask, how did we get from rush mats and sleeping shoulder to shoulder to firm coils and closed doors? And what have we gained or lost along the way? Good evening. As the world around you quiets and your thoughts begin to soften, let's take a gentle step into the hills. Not the hills of folklore or poetry, but the real ones, scraggy, stubborn, and the people who, one pace at a time, turned those hills into maps. Tonight's story begins not with a great explorer, but with a quiet woman carrying a slate and a stick. While most girls her age were learning embroidery or fetching water, Jean followed her grandfather into the mountains. He was a land surveyor, humble one, not famous, not wealthy, but meticulous. Her name was Jean. She lived in the French Alps in the late 1700s, near a small hamlet where the houses clung to the slope like moss. He taught her to measure by pace, to track the sun with a stick's shadow, and to sketch the horizon without letting imagination fill the gaps. Jean learned early that the world looked different from above. When standing in the village square, the mountains seemed to rise like barriers. But once she climbed, one foot in front of the other, she saw how valleys wove between them, rivers glinting, ridges folding, paths snaking where no paths should be. Her slate was always tucked under her shawl, and a leather-bound notebook rode in the pocket of her wool skirt. At age 15, she made her first map, a sketch of 3 grazing routes between villages, showing a shortcut few knew. She didn't sign it, but her grandfather quietly tucked it into his satchel, and it found its way into the town register. A wavy line with a tick above it meant there was a stream, but only in spring. By 17, she was mapping boundaries between farms. Not officially, women weren't hired for such work, but often. Mapping in that time wasn't grand. They were maps for shepherds, for farmers, and for people who needed to know where to lead their cattle, how to avoid a bog, or when a footbridge might wash out. Stone wall half buried. The path turns muddy after rain. Before the storm. Or, my grandfather said there was once a stone cross by that bend. It was slow, repetitive, gentle. She used chains, lengths of knotted rope carried by her grandfather or a neighbor. She used lampblack and vinegar for pigment and sharpened her own quills from fallen feathers. She held up a stick with a notch and lined it against the distant tree line, estimating slope and distance by the angle of her elbow. No aerial surveys, no compasses for common folk, much less. Her letters curled delicate leans of places, some real, others whispered. There were no satellites. Jean measured with her body. She counted steps. She made notes in symbols only she could read. A circle meant a boulder. 3 dots meant elderberry bushes. She wrote things like a tax assessor. Once copied one and sent it to the district clerk. His story, she marked with a small loaf, drawn in miniature. But then paused. Actually, it was my granddaughter. Not official. But remembered. She didn't mind. She had the freedom to roam. The hills were hers. Field slopes, east. These weren't maps for soldiers or scholars. Sometimes, she sketched in silence for hours, sitting with her back against a tree, watching how shadows moved across the slope. A string of blue beads tied to her satchel, a charm from her mother, not for protection from wolves, but from arrogant officials. Other times, she walked with elders who pointed with their walking sticks, saying the trail used to run there. Jean recorded it all, not just the land, but the memory of land. Cartography then was as much about storytelling as geometry. What value did the quiet lines of a mountain woman truly hold? The world shifted. Rivers changed course. Paths were forgotten. And women like Jean didn't just map what was, they mapped what had been. In the winter months, she stayed inside and inked her sketches with care. She traced the curves of ridge lines as if drawing the back of a sleeping giant. Col de la Brume, Croix de Silencio, the path of lost bread, named for a tale of a baker's boy who vanished in a snowstorm. No one paid her. Not at first, but slowly, her maps spread. Shepherds used them, then landowners. Eventually, a clerk arrived to ask who had made the remarkably clear chart of Les Trois Ravens. Her grandfather answered. The clerk blinked. She a woman. She walks more than most men, her grandfather replied. And that was the beginning. Soon, Jean was given official requests not as a cartographer, but as an assistant. She mapped vineyards, forest lines, pasture routes. Once, she was asked to chart the descent routes from a steep pass where too many goats had slipped. Her ink-stained fingers became a quiet badge of honor. Her walking stick, worn smooth. Her boots, resoled 3 times a year. And still, she walked. She carried dried fruit in her pouch, a folded wax cloth in case of rain. When people asked why she mapped why, she walked so far and drew so carefully, she simply said, to remember where we are. But in an age where borders changed with wars, and maps were redrawn by kings in rooms full of smoke and velvet, the summer of 1789 brought change, not just in Paris, where rumors swirled like smoke, but even in the Alpine villages, where Jean Savine lived and mapped. Whispers of revolution traveled slowly, passed from grain sellers to priests to tavern benches. But while noble heads rolled far to the west, Jean kept drawing. She did not chart revolution. She charted goat paths, cold springs, and the strange lean of a leaning pine. Her mountains didn't care for politics, but soon the world would start caring about her mountains. A newly minted surveyor from Lyon arrived that year, assigned by the provisional government to verify tax borders and commune boundaries in the rural southeast. His name was Etienne Mallet, and he wore good boots. On his first day in Jean's village, he unrolled a large, newly printed map lines, sharp corners, stamped. This, he said to the gathered elders, is how the new departments are divided. We require precision. Jean, standing just behind the tavern's half door, looked once at the parchment and quietly shook her head. The lines did not match the ridge. Valleys were drawn like a child's scribbles. Whole farms were placed on the wrong side of borders. A trail she'd walked 20 times was completely missing. Later, as Etienne scribbled notes into his leather-bound ledger, Jean approached. I've mapped that pass, she said. A footpath traced in fine lines around a slope she knew to be impassable half the year. He glanced up. Pardon, The one you marked near Roachgrise. There's no throughway, just shale and snow. The real trail cuts south. He frowned. And you are. She handed him her latest sketch. Simple. Clean. The valleys were shaded in with soot and ash. Etienne looked silently, then looked again. Accurate. She read from stone and slope. He, with his theodolite, a cumbersome brass tool for measuring angles, and she with her chalk and paste count. She shrugged. Closer than yours. Thus began an unusual alliance. You'll lose a mule if you try. Each day, Etienne and Jean met beneath a wooden awning near the grain house. He had studied geometry and lion. She had studied. He read from instruction manuals. She showed him how clouds foretold wind shifts and high power. They summoned him to Grenoble to explain how, in only 6 weeks, he had mapped more ridges and viable footpaths than the last 3 teams combined. At first, he corrected her. Your scale is imprecise. He noted once, pointing to her inked margin. She nodded, then pointed to a trail he'd marked as passable. It's underwater for 3 weeks. Every spring, the stream swells from melt runoff. He never doubted her again. She walks faster than our couriers. She's never lost her way. They walked together, measured trees, slopes, and shadows. He taught her triangulation. He began to write on his official charts. She never signed her own name. By autumn, officials in the regional office had noticed Etienne's unusually detailed submissions. They would carry fine equipment, stay in inns, publish papers. She documented a collapsed bridge with a note. Unstable until rebuilt. Do not cross with carts. Not always precise, but practical. Years later, that note would prevent a trade convoy from tipping into the ravine. He mentioned Jean by name. They raised eyebrows. A woman, he nodded. She simply said, here's how to get there, until the rope she used for pacing felt too heavy for her shoulders. Still, they refused to acknowledge her formally. Too dangerous, they thought. Too improper. But they began requesting local assistance for every rural survey. Unspoken, but understood. Jean didn't mind. She wasn't looking for acknowledgement. She continued her quiet work, measuring, sketching, and revising. A midwife followed her trail to a farm no carriage could reach. She traced the landslides after storms. She charted where herders said, wolves prowled in winter. She was asked, once, to join a university team headed to the Pyrenees. She declined. I'd rather draw my own hills, she said. Her maps began to spread, not through bookstores or publications, but through hands. A merchant copied one for his apprentice. A priest used another to guide Her drawings became the quiet web that connected hamlets, paths, and stories. They were updated in the margins with local news. Storm washed out footbridge near Fernbrook's eastern ridge. Bear sightings on lower trail. Walk with a stick. New shrine placed at bend near pine, split by lightning. She didn't claim ownership. She walked until her knees no longer bent to Zilly, until the pencil shook in her hand. Then she passed her tools to a younger woman, a weaver's daughter, with strong calves and sharp eyes. Jean gave her a notebook, a compass, and one piece of advice. Don't trust the big maps. Trust your steps. But how many official borders today still stretch along the careful lines Jean once sketched with soot and chalk lines never acknowledged, yet still obeyed? Bench beside her door. She watched how fog collected in the valleys each morning, how the sunlight crept down the mountains like spilled honey. The satchel she once carried now hung from a nail on the wall. Inside, her final notebook, half filled, its pages trembling where her hand had grown unsteady. But the maps continued without her. Not copies, exactly. Traces, adaptations. Younger surveyors came, seeking her notes. They arrived with brass compasses, ink bottles, clean boots. She always asked the same question. Have you walked the land yet? Some had, most hadn't. She would close her eyes and describe the years past. Jean Savine no longer climbed every ridge, but her eyes still studied the horizon. From the terrain, After the third curve past the chapel, the path splits. The left side looks easier. It's not. It floods. Stay right and nod. A line of thanks. She always declined. The oak tree with the hollow trunk, keep that on your left, and you'll find the old mule trail. I just took notes. They wrote everything down. A few offered to include her name in their publications. I didn't invent the mountain, she said. Carried Jean's notebook in her satchel, now worn soft at the edges. There was no plaque, no monument. When she passed away, her village marked the moment quietly, but everyone who used the maps understood what it meant. But in the church ledger, beneath her name and age, someone added, known for walking, known for knowing. It's faded. The edges are browned. The writing is nearly That spring, the woman she had mentored, Claire, the weaver's daughter, took up her roots. She updated old maps, traced new trails. She added a small symbol to the bottom corner of each map. A curved line, shaped like a mountain path, winding upward. It was never explained. In the decades that followed, roads were built where footpaths had been. Bridges replaced rope crossings. The government published new maps, clean, crisp, measured with machines. But travelers still found Jean's versions tucked into cupboards, folded into rucksacks, pinned to the walls of hunting cabins. Who charted the world? Not to divide it, but to understand it step by step, shadow by shadow. They weren't precise by modern standards, but they told you what you needed to know. Where the wind changed, where the earth slid, where the sun disappeared behind the peaks too early, and where someone, long ago, had walked before you. Today, in archives beneath a regional library in Grenoble, one of Jean's original inked sketches is preserved in a glass case. But the lines, delicate, deliberate, still guide the eye through valleys and past symbols of boulders and trees. And finally, to a small circle marked simply. Where the view begins, there is no coordinate, no label, just that phrase, and it feels enough. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think of the ones who mapped without, who walked instead of commanded.